whenever there's this sort of pervasive lying, I don't usually say it, but you're right. Pervasive lying or mistruths or changing of the truth, casually, and people start wondering what is actually true. Can we really trust anything? And that's actually fuels the creation of all sorts of these crazy conspiracy theories, right? And I find this actually the most disturbing because it's like not sort of having this commitment, to, especially for the scientific community, to promote, the best they can of truthful information each time and share that, kind of creates this whole ecosystem, it seems to me at least, of all sorts of crazy conspiracy stuff. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you completely. I think we should be aware as well that conspiracy theories have always existed. I think the reason that it's an issue that's coming to the fore at the moment is the technological progress that has happened, particularly in the last 10 years. If you think about the fact we recently, only very recently, commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there were huge numbers of conspiracies about that particular event. And it never occurred to anyone that they should be censored. That was never a conversation we were having at that time. It was never a conversation that was had 10 years, 20 years. Even now, we don't censor conspiracy theories about 9/11 at all. And yet, for some reason, it has now become very fashionable to talk about censoring all sorts of other stuff that is conspiracy that, I'm not someone who really believes any of these conspiracy theories, but I think the reason we've become so obsessed with them and trying to clamp down on them is the power of modern technology and the ability to spread information so virally as we now can.
Well, the lab origin as a possibility of the coronavirus is one of these conspiracy theories, or at least so we were told.
Not anymore, right? Now, most sensible people seem to accept that is probably where the virus came from. And I think, Jan, you point out such an important issue, which is the reason that I mentioned my parents. Both my parents are biochemical engineers. They're highly trained scientists in the Soviet Union. And this is what they always inculcated in me, the idea that there is a scientific consensus about some issue. Yeah, sure, there are times when most scientists agree about a particular issue. But the process of science is one of constant questioning and inquiry and skepticism. And in my house, as I say, my parents were both scientists. We had all sorts of books about all sorts of crazy notions and ideas that my parents would read, and they would read them skeptically and critically. And they would say, look, Konstantin, you must read this book. You got to remember, you've got to apply your own critical thinking to this. And let's have a conversation around the dinner table about the strengths and flaws in this argument. And I just feel like the problem with a lot of what we're seeing now is we're completely losing the ability to hold ideas in our heads without immediately either believing them or rejecting them, and actually allowing us as a society to have useful conversations about things about which we're not actually certain.
This is something I wanted to ask you about. You wrote a piece, I believe, for The Spectator, where you talked about basically not subscribing to the BLM as an organization narrative, so to speak. It's in some ways, a very US phenomenon, but it's something that became a kind of global phenomenon.
Right. It started as a US phenomenon, but it certainly didn't finish that way. It became a global thing. And look, in the UK, where police officers in this country do not kill unarmed suspects from minority backgrounds. Police officers mostly don't carry firearms. We have a few specialist units that do. In the year in which we had mass protests on the streets of London and other cities about that issue, the previous year, for which we have recorded statistics, 2 people in this country were killed by the police who were from a minority background. One of them was Usman Khan, the London Bridge terrorist, right? We don't have this problem in the UK in the way that it exists in America, to the extent that it exists in America. And so to see the whole of society descend into some kind of moral panic was, to me, completely absurd. And again, I think a lot of people listening to me talking about this will be tempted to think that I am some kind of right-wing, reactionary, pro-Brexit, pro-Trump, anti-BLM, anti-everything. But yeah, I'm not pro-anything other than the facts and the truth, right? And for some reason, that makes me some kind of outspoken person, and I don't get it. The facts of the matter are that BLM is not an issue that's relevant to the UK in that way. It's not to say we don't have individual instances of racism, but Britain is not a systemically racist country. It's not a racist country at all. I mean, the argument about saying that Britain is a systemically racist country, to me, sounds like saying that Britain is a murderous country systemically because some people murder people in the country, right? Terrible things will always happen. There's always a fringe of idiots and despicable people in society. As someone who's dark-skinned, first-generation immigrant like me, I'm not unaware of the fact that racism exists. Of course it does. But to slander the entire country in this way is just complete nonsense. Britain and America, two of the most progressive, if you like, countries on these issues in the history of human civilization. And to pretend otherwise is a complete nonsense. It was a moral panic. And I felt very strongly that somebody had to start speaking up about it. And it was easier for black people. My friend Zuby, for example, who is a rapper, he spoke out very early about this. And then I thought it was important for other people to start saying what they think. You know, that's kind of one of the things I learned growing up in my early years in the Soviet Union from my family, which was you've got to speak the truth when you see it. And when society goes mad, it's your job, if you are in a position to have an audience to reach, it's your job even more so in those moments to be honest and truthful about what's going on.
I definitely want to ask you what you mean by society going mad. That's very interesting. Before we go there, you know, in the U.S., there's plenty of people backed with what looks to me very solid data that explain, no, the U.S. is not a systemically racist country. There's incredibly credible people like Bob Woodson, who was, you know, deep in the civil rights movement, my friend, who you know, basically just doesn't see any of this, and actually does see a lot of serious systemic problems that just simply get glossed over when you focus on this kind of a narrative.
Sure. No, I agree with you. But in terms of your prior point about society going mad, we've got to remember, Jan, and you'll know this given your background, society goes mad all the time. It's actually quite a normal thing for a bunch of people in society to suddenly decide, you know what, let's get all the Jews together and put them in a camp. Or let's get all the people who have the wrong opinion and put them in the gulag. Or let's get all the witches and burn them. Or let's get all the heretics and slaughter them. Or let's do this, or let's do that. Or let's have a crusade, or let's have a jihad, or whatever it is. It's perfectly normal it's a perfectly normal occurrence in human history for large chunks of society to subscribe to some absolute crazy idea and to go full out wacko on it. It's normal, right? And that's why I think we've got to recognize this is part of the human condition. And that's why people who are willing to speak the truth in those moments are very important. And that's why I encourage other people always to, when they see that happening, when there's a moral panic, which is how Coleman Hughes described it, the BLM craze when we had him on our show, that's what it is. And you've got to recognize it. You've got to explain to people what it is, and you've got to make it okay for people to speak their mind about it.
Well, you know, something that we're facing in the US and Canada, and I don't know how it is in the UK exactly, but is all sorts of calls for various authorities. Sometimes it's social media companies, sometimes it's actually government entities to enforce censorship of speech of a variety of sorts, right? Always with the idea to kind of protect society from bad apples or bad speech or something like this. You can speak truthfully as long as it's the correct truth.
Yeah, you can speak truthfully as long as no one gets upset. And given that we live in a society where people get really upset by facts, you can see where that ends very, very quickly. Look, it's a fundamentally anti-Western, anti-Enlightenment idea. The idea that people must be prevented from speaking. The whole point of the Enlightenment was the dissolution of restrictive dogma, so that people were free to pursue the scientific method, their creativity, whatever it was, to discover the actual truth. And the actual truth gets discovered in the protest of a contest between different ideas, different ideologies, different versions of people's interpretation of things. In that battle between different ideas and different viewpoints, the truth hopefully emerges. That is the Enlightenment Western mentality. And what we have now is increasingly in the West, is an ideology that is fundamentally anti-Western. It sees the West as the root of all evil, and therefore wants to eradicate all of the things that made the West as great as it is from Western society. And of course, that's why, I'm finishing my book at the moment called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. That's what I'm trying to remind people of. If you rip out the founding cornerstone principles of Western civilization from Western civilization, it's not going to stay the same. It's going to be different. And it's not going to be different in a good way either, because you're ripping out the very things that build the society that we now live in which you have freedom and safety and prosperity and security and all of those things. So that's why I fight so hard against it, because not only is it just purely morally wrong, it is fundamentally destructive to the very civilization that we're a part of.